Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl, aka Artsy Island Girl for Pajama Crafter Stamps. Today I'm going to create a Valentine's Day card with the new Meowentine stamp set, as well as the Cats Meow 6x6 paper pad. So this 6x6 paper pad has all sorts of prints on it, double-sided prints that are perfect for Valentine's Day or just love cards or even cards for your favorite cat lover. The Meowentine stamp set is also perfect for the cat lover as well as Valentine's Day, and I love the little play on words with Meowentine's Day in some of those sentiments. So I'm choosing a couple prints that I'm going to use here. I actually end up only using the one with the red background. At first I wasn't sure which one was going to look best with the images that I used and the way they were colored, but I preferred the brighter one rather than the one with the gray background behind the hearts. I wanted it to be a little bit brighter. So the very first thing I do anytime I use a brand new stamp set is I use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It removes any possible manufacturing residue and helps it take ink a little bit better. This is just a habit I've gotten into, and I do it every single time I'm using a new set. Once that's done one time, you don't need to do it again. So I'm stamping on some Bristol cardstock here. I'm going to do my coloring with Prismacolor pencils. So I have Bristol cardstock here. This is my favorite for using the Prismacolor pencils on, and I'm going to be stamping with Stays-On ink. I'm choosing one of the sentiments from the set to stamp on my Bristol cardstock. This one says Happy Meowentines Day. And then I'm choosing 3 of the adorable cat images. Now you can see that I've got some space between the images, and that's because I plan on die cutting them with some circle dies once they're done coloring. You could die cut them first and then stamp them second and color them afterwards. Much easier to have a full sheet of cardstock here and then die cut them afterwards. Then you can place your dies or your images right in the center of those dies. Another option would be to fussy cut these images. There are no coordinating dies with them, but they would be fairly easy, I think, to fussy cut as well. But I thought a circle die would be very simple, but nice on the front of the card. Now you don't want to leave Stays-On ink on stamps, so I use some Ultra Clean to clean them off before putting them away. I have done it in the past where I taught a class with Stays-On ink, planned on cleaning them once I got home and completely forgot about them, and next time I went to use those stamps they had degraded. So you definitely do need to make sure that you're good about cleaning the Stays-On ink off of your stamps. So don't do what I did and lose a stamp set because of it. Make sure you clean them off, and the Ultra Clean works really quick and easily. First thing I'm going to do is use my trimmer to trim down my sentiment. That way it's ready to go once I'm completely done. You could wait till later, but I don't want to possibly color in any of the area. Now I use my guillotine trimmer here, and I just use the side of the finger guard to judge how far I'm trimming from my sentiment. Then I flip it to the other side, do the same thing, and just kind of eyeball it to make sure that it is straight. Most of the time that works. Sometimes I have to do a second trimming to make sure that I've trimmed it properly, but I like to have little tiny strips, and that's the easiest way that works for me. As I said before, I'm coloring my images with Prismacolor pencils, and once they're colored, I'm going to use some Gamsol and a paper stamp to blend that ink in. And the reason I love coloring in this way is because you don't need a perfectionist with coloring. I color lightly at first, and then I go back in with a heavier hand with the pencil crayon where I want my color to be darkest. When it comes time to blend the color together, that Gamsol with the paper stamp is going to dissolve the pigments in that pencil crayon, and it's going to blend them out. So even if you see some streaks when you're first coloring it, that's going to blend them out. It's one of those things that it's a really easy technique. It does get better over time, or easier over time, the more you do it, as with a lot of different things. Sometimes it takes a little bit of practice, but I really love the final look of it and how that Gamsol and paper stamp makes it really easy to blend out any possible color or pencil strokes, if you will. So first thing I do is use some light cerulean on the outer edges of the images. Whenever, for the most part, I color images, I like my color to be right close to the image and just kind of fade out into nothing. I don't typically color the entire background. It gives the hint of a sky or a background behind it, but it's A, less coloring, and B, I just like the look of it. I think it looks a little bit more interesting. If you prefer, you definitely could color the whole area behind your images. If you just enjoy coloring so much that you want to color more area, absolutely go for it. Again, I just really love the suggestion of a background there. For one of my cats, I'm going to do a black cat. So that one is done with 935 black. And of course, we don't want to lose all of our lines from our stamp here. So I'm not doing dark black here. I'm doing a light hand. And when I have done my light coat of the color, I will go in some areas and be a little bit darker. But I'm also going to be aware of where those lines are and make sure that I don't completely cover them. I don't want to lose all of the detail from that adorable image. I'm choosing to do all three of my cats a shade of gray or black because I still haven't chosen which one of those backgrounds I plan to use with this. And I don't necessarily want a brown cat and then have gray on the background. You absolutely could create a brown cat if you want, or if you have different paper to go with it. I wanted the colors that I chose for my images to coordinate nicely with those printed papers. For the next color I'm using a medium tone of gray. So this is number 1065, 70% cool gray. You can pick and choose which colors you want. You can swap these out for different colors, obviously. They're going to work just the same. Again, I'm choosing to do ones that are in blacks and grays. This cat that I'm coloring here almost looks a little bit more like a tabby cat, but I'm going to color him in that medium gray. And then some of those lines and details, I'm going to put that black in. Again, not being super dark with it. I don't want to cover all of those detail lines, but I do want to give or want to color some of those drawn in details for that cat. The last color I'm using here is number 1060, 20% cool gray. I'm using cool grays for all of these because I think it's going to go best with the gray in that background that I might be using, or the printed paper I might be using. I also tend to prefer cool grays. In my opinion, sometimes warm grays look a little bit dirty because of the brown tones in them. They're just not my favorite. I prefer the look of cool grays. I think they just look a little bit cleaner. For the pink shade that I'm using here, I have 928 blush pink. I'm using very few colors. I only have 6 pencil crayons here that I'm using. You could bring in more if you want. I was just going to keep the palette really, really simple. Often when I'm coloring, I try to keep the palette fairly simple and use as few colors as possible so that there's not 1,000 different colors that are needed. So I color in some of the hearts in that blush pink. Then the next color I'm using is 924 crimson red. And I realized I didn't actually show the camera that. Again, with that red, I go and color lightly first, and then I go in and add some darker tones to it. Once everything is colored, I'm ready to blend those colors out. So I have a little dish here that I pour my Gamsol in. The paper stump I'm using is a really, really thin one because some of these areas are really, really tiny. So I want to be able to get right into them. I have a piece of sandpaper to my right. This one's 400 grit. It's just a piece that I have in my craft room that I found leftover from a previous project. What you're going to use that sandpaper for is sanding off the end of that paper stump when you're changing colors. So I started off with the pink first, and then I went in and blended out the red. Then I used that sandpaper to sand off that red. The red has quite a bit of pigment in it, so you want to make sure that there's no color left on that paper stump before going in and going into a different color and possibly getting some streaks of red in there. Next, I'll be blending all of the gray areas, and I start with the lightest tones first and work my way darker. When you're working with darker tones, there's more pigment on the end of that paper stump, and you would have to sand it off a little bit more to clean it off. So by starting with the lighter colors, I'm not going to contaminate the darker ones if I go into them with a little bit of a light color on my paper stump. So anytime I'm working in different areas, I do the lightest tones of that color first, then work my way to the darkest tones. And I do that whole color family first. Here we only have 3 different color families. We've got the grays, we've got the red pinks, and then we've got the blue for the background. So there's not going to be a whole lot of needing to sand that paper stump down, but I always do lightest to darkest anytime I'm working with a color family. And I tend to choose the color families that have the most pigment last so that there's less of a chance of contaminating a different color with that color. Once I have the pinks done as well as the grays, and I'm including the red and the pink, I go in and do the blues for the background. So just like the grays and the reds, I start with the lightest colored areas first for all 3 images, and then I go and I blend out the darker parts of those areas. That way I'm not accidentally blending some of the darker blue areas into the lighter blue areas and spreading that farther than I really want it to go. I'm working in a circular motion. This is just the way that it works for me. I'm used to that with coloring with Copic markers, working in a little bit of a circular motion. And I find that with this, it works well as well. So I do the light areas first, then I go in the dark areas. And sometimes when you're working with the dark areas, you'll find you get a little bit of streaks or you get a little bit of lines from those pigments. I just go and blend that out just a tiny little bit more. Sometimes I'll dip a little bit or dip my paper stump into a little bit more Gamsol, and you just keep blending it until you're happy with the result. The nice thing about using the Gamsol with the Bristol cardstock and the Prismacolor pencils is that paper doesn't start to break down and pill. So you don't have to worry about working really, really quickly before that paper breaks down. It never starts to pill on you, so it's really easy to keep working at that area if you want to. If it's not quite blended the way you want to, you can keep working at it. Now, I chose to color these with Prismacolor pencils, but watercoloring them would look great as well. Even Copic marker coloring would be fantastic for these images. You could also color them with dye-based markers. That's not really my favorite way of coloring, simply because paper tends to start pilling really quickly with dye-based markers. So I tend to prefer alcohol markers, Prismacolor pencils, or doing watercolors. But whatever your favorite way of coloring, it's going to work for you. Just be sure to change up the paper that you're working on to the medium that you're using. So for watercolor, use watercolor cardstock. For alcohol markers, my favorite has been Hammermill cardstock lately. But again, don't use the same paper for all three. There's different ones that work best for them. So once those images are colored, I can match up different circle dies to them. I use some Best Ever Craft tape to tape that in place so that those dies are not going to move on me while I'm die cutting them, and then I die cut those shapes. Now I'm choosing to use circle dies because that's what I have that's going to work best for these images. But if you happen to have heart dies, I think those would look fantastic as well and would definitely suit the Valentine's theme as well as the heart background paper that I'm using. And you can see that I finally made the decision. I chose to use the heart background paper that has that red background. I trimmed that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then I have some black cardstock here that I trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And then I'm gluing those to my A2 card base. The glue that I'm using is Barely Art glue. It's my favorite liquid glue. Liquid glue gives you that wiggle room and it starts to hold pretty quickly, so you don't have to wait for a long time for it to dry. I've never found that it starts to warp the paper in any way, so I don't have to worry about that. I have it in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for gluing little tiny die cuts together as well as gluing larger pieces like this together for cards. Off screen, I chose some black cardstock and die cut some circles that were a little bit bigger from each size so that each one of those circles would have a mat around it. So before I start gluing those circles to my card base, I just place them on there just to make sure that the arrangement that I have planned in my head is going to work. When I cut down my little sentiment strip, I left the ends long because I wasn't sure if I was going to kind of create a flag at the end of them. I ended up deciding to just cut them straight. So at this point, I used my guillotine trimmer to do that. You could also just use scissors to cut them straight if you're confident with your straight cutting skills. And then we can glue those circles onto the base of our card. I have 2 of them overlapping each other, and then the third is just off to the top left. Then I'm going to glue that sentiment strip down. Now I'm gluing that sentiment strip right down to the card, but if you wanted, you could put some pop dots behind there or foam tape behind there to give it a little bit of dimension. One of the ways that I love adding a little bit of sparkle and texture to my cards is by using some Stardust stickles. It doesn't add any color. You can see the color that was colored underneath it through it, so it just adds some opalescent sparkle. It just adds a little bit of a different texture and it gives the card something to catch the light. Then I'm also using some glossy accents for a few of those balloons as well as the little heart things on top of the bottom cat's head. That's just going to give it some glossy dimension. Again, something to catch the light, but it's going to have a different shine than the stickles will. Let that dry for about 15-20 minutes or so, and now we have an adorable Valentine's card perfect for a cat lover. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.